Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for another episode of Spanning the Need. Tonight, we will be talking with community leader Derrick McDowell, discussing a variety of topics that are affecting our communities today. Thank you for joining us tonight, Derrick, out of your busy schedule.
Hey, thanks for having me, Anthony. I appreciate it.
Anytime. So right now, actually, we're inside, so the weather's actually pretty decent out. So this is a time that we'll be able to enjoy with our families moving forward in the summer. So
yeah, I'm excited.
You're very involved in the community as a community leader from a variety of different perspectives. Tell us how you got started to end up where you are now.
Well, it's interesting because, my wife often tells me that she's not sure what to tell people that she works with or friends what I do. And I just told her, to make it easy, I have the honor and the pleasure to just love Youngstown. That's something I get to enjoy doing. And there's work that goes along with that, obviously, that comes from a number of different angles, as you stated. But that's truly what sums it all up, is that here is a guy who, wants to just love on his city in any way that he can. And so, it's certainly creating the Youngstown Flea, which is the outdoor market that happens once a month downtown next to the Cavelli Center. That was one way in which I wanted to, teach entrepreneurship to a community, to bring some economic sustainability, to showcase our creativity, right? I traveled a bit and found that was existed in so many other communities. And then you come home and it's absent. And I looked and I said, we have what it takes to build that same thing. We have creative vendors who know how to work with their hands and make things. And so, building the Youngstown Flea has been an exciting thing. The community's very much responded, very supportive to it. That led to, the community engagement and inclusion coordinator role that I now carry with the Youngstown Foundation Amphitheater, working as a liaison between the city of Youngstown and the management group, JAC, and Eric Ryan through the Cavelli Center, the amphitheater, Ween Park. Those things have all been, sort of the things you see visibly be doing in the community. But again, they all lead back to the same thing, which is loving on the city of Youngstown.
Well, and I think that brings you to a very great position, is you look at making everyone come together, really making everyone understand what's going on, really making a difference in the community. And I think with that position that you have down at the new amphitheater, that you have that extension of what you do best. So how do you plan on using what you have experience-wise to really bring a very diverse culture to the amphitheater?
Well, you know what? Those positions, in the society we live in today, you have to sometimes recognize what's at play. In any community, influence and leverage, they have value and worth in our society, whether it be a social media influence or leverage, whether it be a community influence or leverage. And so in some cases, because the community was not very familiar with who I was as a person, then as I created things like the Youngstown Flea and got involved with community engagement with the amphitheater, that certainly brought along with it influence and leverage in the community. But I'm one of those people that if I said I could have one thing, it would be mind control. It's my superpower, right? But it would be only a wonderful mind control, because certainly when you have mind control or people are willing to get along on board with some of your ideas, it makes it much simpler to do the things you want to see done in your community, which all tie back to me loving on this city. I want to bring wonderful things to this community. And so, getting us to gather has been one of those stepping stones that I've used as a vehicle to be able to have conversations with the community. So you might see me promoting the Youngstown Flea. What I'm really doing is gathering a community and teaching us how to support one another. When you see concerts happening at the amphitheater, it's not just a surface level, hey, he's doing a movie night. I'm trying to teach us how to do family, So not just focused on what movie are we playing tonight and what's the popcorn taste like, but really engaging families and saying, when's the last time you've been out together and watched a movie? And that's how we learn how to do community better.
And it's basically like getting back to the basics, having that dinner on Sunday afternoon with the family type of mentality.
Yeah.
And you look at it that we were looking at ramping up for a great season at the amphitheater. Then COVID came with the pandemic. So how have you and your family and all have handled the pandemic, kind of being stuck inside?
Well, to your first point, when we talk about what we had planned, I like to joke and tell people we had so many amazing people scheduled this year. We were this close to getting Jay-Z and Beyonce on a buy one, get one deal. You know, we had every artist you could think of. We had them lined up for 2020. It just COVID hit, you know.
Just had to sign that contract.
Yeah, we had the ink. It just didn't dry in time. So yeah, honestly though, that's not joking of a statement. We had an amazing lineup of things planned, and we are revamping that for what we're dealing with now. And we still do have some wonderful things planned. We're going to try and salvage as much of 2020 as we can because we need it and we deserve it, and we can do it coming together. But personally, I can tell you that I am blessed. You know, that my family. You know, again, a 19-year-old who was off to college, who, you know, many colleges closed their dorms and she had to come home. Thankfully, got to spend some time with her. You know, my wife is home. She's a teacher, been doing a lot of things through those Zoom calls like we've all been doing, and had time to do that. And, you know, we've got 4 kids here, all safe, all healthy. We haven't strangled one another. Plenty of family time, and I myself have personally been able to do a number of things that have been important, which is sort of reshape some of my own priorities around family. I can't espouse things to this community if I can't do it in my own home. And I've struggled in a number of ways to do some of the things because of my passion, you know, to drive for results out in this community. You can easily neglect your own home. And so, you know, COVID did force me at a certain point to stop, you know, physically and mentally, because obviously there was nothing going on at the amphitheater. We weren't allowed to have gatherings there, wasn't able to do the flea. Tried a number of different things remotely, but at a certain point I just reached a space where I said, it's okay to take some time off. Everybody else is.
Yeah, and they really are. I mean, you just take time, you sit back, you may be juggling more things at home, kids, family. You're reorganizing the way you do stuff. Yeah.
And I need to be precautious once we see things being reopened here. You know, it's not as easy as 1, 2, 3. I had some time off. Now I got all my priorities straight. You know, there's a ramp up of a lot of work happening, especially with everything that's going on in our cities and our communities and across this country. There's even more work to do now that we've sort of began to admit to things that we always knew were problems. COVID exposed a ton of problems that we already knew. We knew disparities existed across communities of color. You know, certainly the recent murderings, they've exposed some things that need reform. They've exposed some things that need torn down. They've exposed the need to come together in even greater ways. And so now we've not only got to reopen, but we've got to reimagine and reshape a lot of things.
And let's talk a little bit about that, as COVID has really opened up the eyes of America and maybe the world. And we look at what happened 2 weeks ago to George Floyd. How did you feel when that happened?
You know, it's easy to feel in that moment because, you know, we're talking again, hindsight is 2020. So in that moment, as a Black man myself, I felt like, again and again and again, and then to see, you know, the Amy Cooper situation in Central Park, both of those situations just coming off of Ahmaud Arbery, you know, jogging in his neighborhood, it was just a gut-wrenching moment of again, and you don't know if justice is coming in that moment. And so you're left almost, I mean, not even almost, speechless. You're left in anguish. You're left in despair and hopelessness. But I'm a person that springs into action as well, you know, so I don't sit in those moments long. You know, I work with organizations like Mahoney Valley Sojourn to the Past with Penny Wells, and that teaches us the principles of nonviolence, but it also teaches us not to be a silent witness to the things that we see. So my nature isn't to sit in hopelessness and despair to sit in that anguish, even though it might be affecting me. And I look around, I've got two Black boys that are teenagers that are out in these communities that have their driver's license now. I've got a 19-year-old daughter, who's out in these communities as well. And, we've got a community to answer to and be responsible for when these kind of moments happen. Just because it physically didn't happen here doesn't mean that we don't deserve to have these conversations about what are we going to do moving forward. So very, very, very concerning. But it also, I'm one of those people that to whom much is given, much is required. So I'm required, because of who I am and what I want to do and how I want to love this community, to be able to hold things together in moments of crisis and trauma, so that I can spring into action and show others how to get out of that hopelessness and how to get out of that despair and how to spring to action in healthy, meaningful ways. So as much as I wanted to break down like everyone else, I just felt like I couldn't.
And I think everyone can agree that video was very disturbing. It was very disturbing. No one should ever go through something like that. And I think that ignited really where we are now.
Yeah, it's tragic. One of the things that's very frustrating for me and I have to process is, why did it have to take that again to get us to be believed? It's so you welcome the fact that we're here now having these conversations, because we've been trying to get to this point forever. But you have to acknowledge that it took way too much, way too heavy of a price to be paid to reach this moment. And so we're here now. And Congressman John Lewis was quoted as to saying that, we've come a long way. And in most cases, people would say, but we still got a long ways to go. His statement just recently was, we've come a long way and we're not going back. We have to move forward and not take, 2 steps forward and then 1.5 back. We've got to advance now.
It's like the notion, this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon.
Absolutely.
And everyone will do its part.
Yeah. And how you prepare for a sprint versus a marathon is important. Right, your training is different. If as your work as a referee, that I'm going to be reffing, a tournament, that's different than a high school game. AAU tournaments, you got 90 teams, 900 players, you lock and load, and you're going to be running all day. You bring your lunch with you and a lawn chair.
Yeah, exactly. A lawn chair with a cushion in it.
Yeah. So this is that moment where I tell people, this isn't a dipping of the toe. This is a cannonball into the pool moment, where you've got to immerse yourself in this movement, but you have to be prepared for the marathon that it is. But that their work is plentiful too.
And you are actually a key component. If I'm correct, a 17-year-old created a gathering in downtown Youngstown about a week ago. I think she was 17 years old. A 17-year-old or 18 was graduating, put this together, and you had, I think, 1,500 people there. It was a very, very calm protest and very voiced your concerns. You had people from out of town that were causing the problems. But you stepped up where there was some damage in downtown Youngstown. They broke windows in Chaffin Center. And you stepped up and said, back off. You protected the properties of the city of Youngstown. So what does that mean to you when you do that? And what did the rally mean to you as a whole?
Well, yeah, so Sonia Lenore is her name. And I believe she's 18, recent graduate, and reached out to Reverend Lewis Macklin in the community from having a relationship with his daughter, and says, hey, this is something I want to do in the community. I believe the time is now. But she was acknowledging that, hey, I don't know the way forward. I've never done something like this. So, have to commend her and give her kudos for being bold enough to reach out in a moment where I want to do something on a large scale, but I'm not sure how to do it. So we know that we need to engage our youth, and we know we need to guide them. But certainly one of the messages I want to get out to so many people is, don't trample on them either. Give them the room and latitude to do what they need to do. And so, she was bold enough to reach out to us, and we responded through our organization, Mahoning Valley Sojourn to the Past. And we just said, hey, we will help facilitate this moment for you. We don't want to overshadow you. We will use our relationships throughout the community to help pull people together, and we did just as such. Wonderful turnout, as you described. You know, we began at 11:30 downtown and walked from the intersection of Wick and Wood Street as a group, a peaceful assembly, down to the steps of the courthouse. And we had a number of different speakers. We had a girl speak a poem, written word. You know, it's just wonderful. We had, you know, Pastor Todd Johnson give a challenge to police and politicians and the community at large. So it was calling out everyone at this moment, not just, you know, focusing on just one piece of reform that we need. And then you saw a transition, right? There was a breaking off of what we created into something completely different. And that's not a disparaging thing, because we have citizens of this community that have every right to voice their opinions and their express themselves in ways that we didn't maybe fulfill in that 11:30 gathering. There were more people who wanted to have dialogue with the police. There were more people who wanted to express themselves in a number of different ways. And so I hung around after our gathering ended and, you know, just began to be an observer, a fly on the wall as a resident of this community, just to see if I could be of any help, but also to ensure that messages are heard in a peaceful way, because we knew how important the narrative is to our community. We know how stories can get diced up and dissected and sent out there in ways that don't truly articulate Youngstown in the best light. Certainly would never want to fluff any stories, but we understand that we could lead the nation in a time like this by having a peaceful gathering when many other cities are on fire, literally.
Yeah.
We didn't have a canister of tear gas released in our downtown. You know, you could say, you know, no residents were harmed in the making of this peaceful assembly. Now, again, we had moments in which, you know, and I won't just say out of towners, because there were some people from Youngstown who, you know, when you have a gathering, you can easily fall into a group mentality. And so there were some people embedded within that that assembly that, you know, they were very angry, more so angry than some of the other people. They were expressing themselves in ways that more so other people in the crowd weren't. And so I won't say that it was just outsiders or just out of towners. There were some people that, you know, United Way suffered some damage slightly, and, you know, Shoffin's front door. But what it means to me to be able to intervene in a moment like that. And here was my rally cry to everyone in those moments. You deserve to be heard. But if you want this moment to continue, then we cannot distract by getting off mission and destroying our own community.
And
I want you to, you know,
good.
I wanted them to have the opportunity to be heard all night long, if that's how long they wanted to go. And I can tell you that the longer you know, allow these types of things to go on, the quicker this will all get shut down.
And violence is not the answer. And
no, I mean, again, the organization that we work with teaches Dr. King's 6 principles of nonviolence. And so we seek to defeat injustice, not people. And a lot of times people forget that what we're angry at, and I'll say his name, you know, we could be angry and direct all our hate towards Trump. But what we're really angry at is some of the injustices espoused by administrations or our government or politics or our judicial system. That's what we really need to defeat, you know. And so if we stay focused on that, then, you know, less on defeating the people behind it, then we'll get much further. And so don't destroy your community. You know, again, I'm not disparaging, because there are people who are articulating why. When you look at the disparity in wealth in our country, you know, communities of color have been destroyed. You know, you look at our native, you know, people, indigenous people in this community, and they can tell you, like, listen, you've destroyed our land and a lot of our communities. You've broken so many treaties. We can't name them all. And you want to run oil lines through land that is sacred to us. We look at Tulsa. There was a huge, healthy, wealthy Black community that was destroyed there. And so there are people articulating moments of destruction to say, you know, yeah, this isn't maybe how we would want things to be, but can you understand? can you understand where some of this destruction is coming from? Not that you have to agree with it at all, but can you understand that lives have been destroyed? And so some people who just don't know how to articulate themselves in the proper way go out and they feel like destroying something is the only way to get attention, is the only way to take notice. And then there's some people that are opportunists in these moments as well. But when you embed that into an entire group and you try to frame the entire group by the actions of a few, that's unfair. And so that's partly my reasoning for being in those moments as well, is because the wonderful work, the wonderful voices that needed to be heard, all day long would have been overshadowed by some of these moments had we not intervened and ensured that they did not happen in the way that they could have happened. We had a number of different moments that could have happened much differently. I'm telling you, from about 2 p.m. on, it could have been chaos downtown. And moments I witnessed that the crowd wasn't calling for, that the crowd didn't deserve. You drive a SUV through a crowd of people who were just protesting. That's unfair.
Yeah.
That's unfair for them to respond, angrily, and then you try and capture that moment and say, look at them. They're throwing things at a SUV. Well, capture the moment 15, 20 seconds before that where that SUV tried to push through the crowd and almost run people over. And you can understand, not agree with, but understand why someone would throw a water bottle at your SUV.
Yeah, they would aggravate the situation.
So you just aggravate the situation. We had a charter bus that tried to push its way through a crowd of hundreds of people crossing the street. That doesn't help.
Yeah, that doesn't. That really doesn't.
No.
And so let's go back. I was doing some follow up with some things. I found a video of you about 3 years ago.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, you did a video about your heart and your head.
Yeah.
And you said that your heart is what drives you, if I'm correct on that statement.
Yeah.
So how do you take what we've experienced in the last 2 to 3 weeks and move forward with everything with your heart?
You know what? You always have to be a person of self-evaluation, I believe, to thine own self be true, right? And so I try and stay true to myself that a lot of things are led by my drive and my passion and my heart. And somebody told me, and if you read maybe some of the comments under that video, if you found it on social media, somebody says, well, that's the worst way to do business. And I said, listen, I use my head too. I'm not an idiot. But you have much more of who Derrick is if you allow my heart into situations. And I'll give a quick example, right? Because I could tell you that some things aren't heart-led, even though they are well-intentioned. And I'm going to get on a dicey moment here for you, to just stay with me, right? So let's look at the term white privilege. That's a term that people hear. And up until now, possibly, we just sort of rejected it, like it was, garlic to a vampire or a cross to a vampire. And so how I use my heart is I have to look at that and say, what are we really trying to say to people in that moment? And so am I just trying to lob this accusation at you to guilt you into doing things? Or really does white privilege sound a little bit more like this? From my heart, what I want to say to you, Anthony, is that we live in a society that statistically is 60% white. And if you add in Hispanics who identify as white, it's closer to 70% white. So 346 million Americans, 70% of them identify as white. And so you have to understand that as the dominant majority race in this society, you have an advantage. That is what the word privilege means. A lot of people interpret it to mean as if they had a silver spoon in their mouth when they were born, and that's the wrong interpretation. It would be no different than if I positioned to you that would you rather be tall or short in the NBA? Because if you're tall, you have a better advantage over short people. You can get to the rim a lot easier if you're trying to dunk when you're tall. You can block shots a lot easier when you're tall. So you've been given an advantage to be tall. Rich over poor gives you so many other advantages. And so white in a society that's predominantly white gives you an advantage in a number of different ways. You get to learn about racism rather than experience it. You get the benefit of the doubt rather than the guilty until proven innocent, the opposite of what our law and justice system is about. And so what I'm saying to you from my heart is all I want you to do is recognize those advantages and take the privilege of using them on everyone's behalf and start advocating. Now, that statement in and of itself is much longer than the statement, Anthony, you've got white privilege. So I would rather lead with my heart and have that longer conversation with you in an effort to try and get you to understand what I'm saying than to lob at you with my head, you've got white privilege, and now try and cause you to feel guilty. I don't want anyone to feel guilty for the color of their skin, but I do want people to recognize even I've got advantages. I'm 6'3" and I'm Black and I'm not poor. I'm educated, I work hard. Those are advantages in this society that I have the privilege of using to further causes that are dear to my heart.
And I think that's a great statement. It crosses all boundaries. It really shows what we're really looking at. I mean, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think
so if more people led with a little bit of heart, and it's difficult. It's not easy because quite honestly, and I'll tell you a quick story. I remember the movie Selma came out, and it, documents Dr. King's involvement, John Lewis's involvement in the march from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights in Selma, Alabama. And the rapper Common, along with the R&B singer John Legend, came out with a song called Glory that went along with the soundtrack to that movie. And I believe they won some prestigious award. I don't know which one. I'm just going to call it a Grammy, whatever they won. So it brought a lot of attention and popularity to the movie and the song. Well, they asked the rapper Common. They says, in this time where we're struggling with racism, what's the answer? What is the answer? And his answer was brief. He says, I believe that we need to extend a hand in love to those struggling during this moment. And that's the only thing that's going to get us through this moment. And can I tell you that some of the comments that came from his statement were from a number of African Americans who said, we've tried to extend our hand over and over and over in love, and people just keep cutting off our hand. There are some people who are angry, who have lost trust in this moment, who have been so traumatized that it's very difficult to ask them to lead with their heart right now. And to those people, we're going to have to give them time to heal. But I'm in what I would consider a much more healthy space to be able to do things in my community where I can lead with my heart and see the perspective of all sides of things before I go with my head and then, cut off opportunities to have dialogue with people because I'm so angry.
And I think that brings a great point where, as you know, George Floyd's funeral was today. In almost about 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks. What do you think we've learned since his passing?
I would hope that we've learned that this wasn't all fake, that the cries of communities weren't just, chicken little pie in the sky, falling cries, that these are real and that people are to be believed. And that, as we go back and think about some of the other instances in which we tried to write them off as simply someone being non-compliant with law enforcement, or the numbers just don't support the disparities that we're talking about, or the statistics aren't in favor of what they're complaining about, that we sort of now can just admit to ourselves that some of the things that have been brought to the table for so many years and decades and centuries, to be honest, are real. They're much more real than we wanted to believe. And so I hope that we've learned that the cry, these aren't fake tears. And a number of communities suffer that, unfortunately. The Jewish community suffers people who are Holocaust deniers still. And so hopefully we get beyond some of these moments of having to prove out that things are real. Again, Amy Cooper shows us in Central Park how quick someone can turn on a black male simply because she was asked to leash her dog, which was park rules for the area they were in. And she literally turned to one of the worst things you can do in this community, which is threatening a black male with the threat of calling the police on him and telling them that he was going to do harm to her and her pet. So that I bet you everyone who would describe her 10 minutes prior to that moment would have described her as one of the most wonderful people you could have known. Someone who would do this, this, and that for her community. Someone who wouldn't have a racist bone in her body. Someone who was colorblind and was raised to see all people fair and equal. But we have within us all these prejudices that when pushed to a moment, we don't know what we would say. And she proves that. And so now we have to acknowledge that. We can't deny it. So what I would say is we cannot take the last 2 weeks and pretend that we haven't been trying to get attention in these ways before. But hopefully over the last 2 weeks, we can now start arguing about what's real and what's not. It's not just a boogeyman hiding in the closet or under the bed. This is really real. Racism in this community, in our cities, and in this country is still alive and well. We tried to say that after Obama was elected, that we were post-racial. You know, how foolish of us to believe that when so many people were still crying out during those moments. But I also hope that we've learned in the last 2 weeks that we cannot sit idly by. We cannot dip a toe in this moment. We've got to engage and we've got to do something. We've got to spring into action. Now, there's a number of people who don't know how to do that. But acknowledging you don't know what you're doing or don't know how to move forward is the first step for you. And so for the rest of us who do know better, you know, we've got to do better. When you know better, you do better.
Exactly. And actually, that was going to be my next question is people are watching this. And right now, what can they do? Can you elaborate a little bit more on what someone can do while they're watching? What advice can you give them?
Sure. And again, you know, advice can be very, you know, tricky because, you know, you've got a diverse audience. I remember talking with a friend just recently who asked me advice as a parent, and that can be different advice in this moment to some people. So Josh, I'll run through quickly with her, you know, what I said to a parent who's looking for what to do in this moment, right? She's got 2 small boys. I said, number one, as a parent, you know your family best. And so you're going to have to survey whether I need to have a family meeting or individual meetings with my kids. What's age appropriate and what's not? As a spouse, what do I need to talk with my husband about that we need to do for our family moving forward? Number 2, you can't give anything to your kids if you don't have it yourself. So you can't educate them about things you're not educated on. So you're going to have to steep yourself into the moment and ask myself, what is it that I want my kids to know? And what do I really know? Am I able to teach them? Or do I need to bring in some support? And number 3, it comes down to, again, what we talked about earlier, what are we ready to acknowledge as a family before we begin working on? Are we willing to acknowledge that the community we live in is 99% white? And we need to do something about why there's not more diversity in our own community. The school my children attend, none of the teachers are people of color. None of the students are really people of color. The experience that my children are getting has no diversity. Things like dropping statements like I'm colorblind. We're prepared to do that as a family because we're not colorblind. If I asked you to go to the Mill Creek Flower Gardens with me, you wouldn't say you were colorblind. So why do we say that with people? You know, I told her, don't clench up in moments when your kids ask you difficult questions. Be prepared for them. If you're in line at the grocery store and your kid says, Mommy, why is that girl brown? Don't say, oh, I'm so sorry, you know. No, you answer the question practically. She's brown because I'm guessing her parents are brown. And 2 brown people make a brown child. And we'll talk more about it at home. You know?
Yeah, and actually there was a press conference today about unity and reform, where you had a variety of community leaders, some pastors there, and I think there was some police that was there as well. And they were talking about reform, unity, and it looked like, from what I've read, that it was a good thing.
Yeah. So just to be a more generic, for overall audience that's listening about, because I am getting a lot of people asking me, hey, I want to get involved. I posted something today on social media that says every organization within the city of Youngstown and surrounding areas needs to join in the fight of social justice. And that, eyes and ears are watching and listening what you're doing. And I ended it with, please don't make me call you out publicly. And what I say that, people do respond. And so a response was, hey, I'm from a local this organization and we want to get involved. We just don't know how. So let me speak to those people who want to get involved but don't know how. Number one, the first thing, again, you're going to have to do is ask yourself, what are we prepared to acknowledge? Because we cannot fix what we will not boldly acknowledge. Do we have a race problem or don't we? Because if you're still debating on that, then you can't begin to help fix or bring about the reforms that you see happening all across the country. Do we have a police, law enforcement issue in this community or don't we? Have you seen or can point to examples of those things that we're talking about? So what is it that you're prepared to acknowledge first and foremost before you try and spring into action? Be no different in a relationship if you offended a friend. If you offended me, Anthony, and I said to you, hey, man, that was a little bit offensive what you said to me. Are you prepared to acknowledge the offense? Or are you saying, I was just kidding?
Oh, I would. Trust me, you can ask my wife. When I'm wrong, I say I'm wrong and I apologize. And
that's a beginning. That's a beginning for an individual. So we've got to begin within ourselves and say, acknowledge the things that we need to change about ourselves before we try and go out and change the world. The second thing we can do is, if you don't know what to do, find someone who is doing things, a trusted person in your community or your personal life, and seek out advice, on how to begin. I certainly want to be a resource to people in this community on what you can do to help you get plugged in different ways. I spoke with someone in the community who's in Boardman, who owns a small business, who deals in, massage therapy. So here's a cool example I gave him. He says, I just don't know what I can do. I'm a middle-aged white guy who owns a business in Boardman. And I said, let me tell you about an article I read a couple months ago that detailed 700 fights in Youngstown city schools. There's only 180 days in the school year.
Exactly.
You're talking 3 to 4 fights a day, right? So I said, why don't you get involved with Youngstown City Schools and teach them relaxation techniques, mindfulness, teach them about conflict resolution, using breathing techniques? That's your involvement. So be authentic with how you're going to get involved. Don't start driving down the street trying to play Tupac and Biggie and act like a supporter by throwing your fist up and saying, Black Lives Matter, if you don't truly mean it. Work in ways that are familiar to you. You know what I mean? If you're a coach, then expand that into communities of color and say, hey, typically only coached in the suburb areas. I want to get involved in some of the communities that are struggling the most. If you're a carpenter or a welder, and take your skill set and bring it to inner cities, and teach them your skill set or your trade. We talk about the lack of job opportunities. If you're a landscaper, I know hard, help is hard to find, but if we groom some of these 6th, 7th, 8th graders and start getting them light yard work, by the time they're adults, they'll be better employees for your landscaping business. So you just have to take what you're good at and what's authentic to you and put it to work in creative ways. And so number one, acknowledge, because we can't fix what we won't acknowledge. If we won't acknowledge offenses, if we won't acknowledge the makeup of our community is challenging, if we won't acknowledge that our teachers are not diverse, our student body's not diverse, our family's not diverse, we haven't had dinner with anybody that doesn't look like us in a pretty long time, then you need to acknowledge that before you can fix it. Educate yourself, right? Before you can jump into action, you need to know what you don't know. And there are plenty of people who can tell you what you don't know if you don't know. There's this old segment, and we can edit this out if it's not appropriate. But if you've ever watched the Chappelle Show, there was a comedian on the Chappelle Show. He had this thing on the Chappelle Show. His name was Paul Mooney.
Yes.
And it was a segment called Ask a Black Guy. And he sat out on the streets of New York just like almost like, hey, you can walk up and ask him any question you wanted to ask. And so, it should be open door policy with us to say, hey, if I don't know who's trusted in my life that can speak into my life, that can help educate me and say, Derrick, tell me what I don't know. Tell me some things that I'm seeing maybe from the wrong perspective. Now, on the surface level, you might not see anything wrong with just for example, your community. Like, what's wrong with my community being predominantly white? These are the people who chose to live here. And now you have to ask yourself, okay, have you ever heard of redlining? Have you ever heard of the era in which we ensure that African Americans and people of color couldn't get loans in communities like yours? Now, fast forward to today and ask yourself, what are the obstacles people face to be able to purchase a home in my community? We know the wealth gap is one reason, but that's not the only reason. Do you know how many people are afraid to drive through Poland?
I don't know. You tell me.
Tons of people. People that I know that are like, I'm legit. I got my driver's license, I got my car insurance, and I still won't drive through. You know what I mean? Where does that perception come from? So maybe we need to, it's no different than a chiropractor who will tell me that most people believe if you get your back cracked, you're going to be addicted to it. It's like, nah, that's not really true. So perceptions can become people's reality. So maybe the answer is that Poland just needs to become a more welcoming community.
Right. As an example. Correct.
That's just an example. I'm not picking on Poland. I'm just saying, does your community feel welcoming? Does your neighborhood, does your street, does your home?
Well, that's the same notion as what we were talking about, you mentioned earlier, because you've actually answered probably 2 or 3 questions that people were going to ask. And I'll just kind of go back is you talk about how people can help. Okay. Use their God-given talent, whatever God gave them, that's their talent.
Sure.
I knew a great man who just passed away on Friday. Bishop Murray was a very good friend of mine. He probably was the Catholic Christian, was one of those gentle giants that when he walked in a room, you just commanded yourself to pay attention, no matter what background you were.
Yeah.
And he just was and I'm still feeling it because I used to talk to him a lot.
Yeah. And I'm sure that, having that trusted, healthy relationship with someone that you allow, because it's a privilege to allow someone to speak into your life. But the only way you were able to do that was not because of his title, but because of his leadership, right? And leadership comes in more forms than just title. Mm-hmm. What you want, the highest form of leadership is admiration. See, you admired him and you were allowed him to speak into your life. That's the only way we're going to have these conversations with people, is people are going to have to say, I admire the work that I see you doing in our community, and I need some help on how to begin. And I'm willing to allow you to speak into my life and let me know. Now, you as the recipient have to be willing to be told some things that you're not going to like.
Exactly.
But the fact that you admire me and know that Derrick's a person that leads with his heart, and Derrick's going to only tell me things that are good for him, me, and this community. See, I want the win-win-win, right? And so I'm not going to lead you astray because you've seen my heart. You've seen me advocate for this community. Why would I tell you something that was counter-narrative to where we want to go? And so if you can trust me and you can admire the work that you see me doing, then allow me to speak into your life and tell you that, Anthony, you've got a platform. You've got an opportunity to do some things in this community that other people may not be able to do. You have a podcast. You're privileged in that way, that you have a voice that people will listen to. And so you now need to be able to use that voice just like you're doing today. See, you've already begun work just right here. I've been doing a podcast, and now I'm going to incorporate this moment into my podcast. Even if your podcast wasn't even about this, your podcast could have been about any number of different things, just, But now I'm going to use that same podcast, to interject voices that, may be uncommon to the nature of the podcast. Again, it's just using authentic. If you're a photographer, just go back and look at your body of work and say, I got to begin to shoot more diversity.
And I think at the end of the day,
treat
someone how you would want to be treated.
Absolutely.
And
we forget that those statements carry so much power. And it's so simple now that we write it off. It's like, oh yeah, treat people the way you want to be treated. One of the other things I want to say before we go, is I've told people, and I'm just about to make this post, right? There's these stages I see.
You're hearing it first here.
So here's an advanced copy of my next post. There are 4 words that are hindering us right now. Those 4 words are, if you need help. It's not if we need help. We need help. We continue to try to absolve ourselves from moments. People are looking at me, if you need help. Like, what do you mean, if I need help? It's time to get involved. And I'm saying that those words are dangerous in this moment right now. That's not if. When can you come help?
Yeah,
there's no more if. Yeah, there's no more if. There's no sidelines to this social justice movement. Like, you can't just sit back. And so I don't mean that you have to go do what I do. Let me tell you a very cool way you could change your environment. Don't just go get Chinese food. Intentionally go get Chinese food and sit down and talk with your family about Asian culture. Go patron, Charlie Staples downtown and talk about, that culture.
Barbecue.
Talk about New Orleans and, the Creole culture in the South, where gumbo comes from. Just if you talk about food, I love Italian. I want to know more about the Italian culture. My wife is Hispanic. I love that culture. I love it. I love the dance. I love the food. I love the people. I love how bright the colors. I love it all. My wife's brother is married to a girl who's Korean. We're like the United Nations when we come together for events in my home, and so why would I not want to see their color? Why would I not want to embrace their culture? So those are simple things that we can do right now that don't take a lot of heavy lifting, but you can't do it if you won't acknowledge it by saying things like, well, I'm colorblind. I was taught not to see. Stop that. See it and love it. Fall in love with it. And that'll change your whole family, right? Because now your children are going to hear, wow, Mom, I love salsa music. I love hip hop. I love, like jazz. I love, and so, that's on a personal level. On a professional level, ask yourself, who do I work for and what are they doing? If you work for a hospital system in this community, what are they doing to provide access to affordable health care in our own community? Who are the people you need to go talk to who are the gatekeepers who have been holding this community back? Quite honestly, maybe they don't even know that they've been holding this community back. There are some key people in this community that I believe that don't recognize that they're a gatekeeper to our success.
And I think on that point is I've been involved just as much as you have downtown over the years. And when Youngstown has changed, there are some people that don't like change because that's just how they grew up. But I think once people warm up to it and understand what was going on downtown, then people started to come back and say, oh yeah, because they were like, hey, downtown, like I talked to people that didn't come down for 20 years, didn't even know there was all these restaurants and the entertainment until they said, well, that's where the Cavelli Center is, or that's where the Chevy Center was. And so I think all you need to do is just open your eyes and go downtown.
Yeah. And, that speaks to one very egregious thing that's been happening all over our community is people and parents telling their kids, don't you go to Youngstown. Trust me, it's happening. They're all over the perceptions. It's interesting how we're only safe in Youngstown when Elton John comes to town or when Blake Shelton comes to town. It's the safest community in the world. Carrie Underwood comes to town. Taylor Swift comes to town. It's the safest neighborhood ever.
Jay-Z. I mean, we've had those artists down
Lil
there.
Wayne, 20,000 people came to see Florida Georgia Line. I can't think of an article that I read about a a carjacking, a robbery, a murder, so how was it so safe?
Well,
Maybe we've got the wrong perceptions about the community.
Well, and I think it's the perception of the past.
Yeah.
Once someone gets a thought on what happened downtown Youngstown the last 20 years after the mills closed, once the population declined. I mean, we at one time had 150 to 175,000 people in the city of Youngstown.
Yeah.
And now we're down to between 60 and 65,000.
Yeah.
So, I chaired the park commission years ago, and we had a park system that was made for $150 to $175,000, or excuse me, 150 to 175,000 people. So at that time, we were looking to downsize and make it more the quality of life. And that's how we looked at that to really make a difference in the community. Then
there's a number of people, who are making completely different, bold steps into the community, right? You look at Ian Beniston and those who run YNDC, who have said, we live in Youngstown. We service this community, but we live in this community as well. I had an article, some months ago, when it was, I think, Liberty schools and I believe either Girard or Hubbard schools. I don't want to misquote. But it talked about that Liberty schools were losing students to, I believe, Girard because of, open enrollment, and, they were taking all this funding with them. And so Liberty had invoked this ruling from the Department of Education that allowed them, because of a racial diversity component, to say that you can take our students, but we don't have to allow the funding to go with them. And that stopped Girard from yanking students. Why is that important? And I spoke out and I said, hey, dear white people, and I meant this from my heart, please stop leaving our communities. Why? Because white flight sends signals. It tells others that, there goes the neighborhood. Where do you think that term comes from? It's someone's belief that the neighborhood is no longer salvageable, and so it's time to move. But if we all do that, then what's Liberty left with? Now, I'm not saying that Liberty gets a free pass and that they shouldn't improve their communities for the people who live there or their educational system. We all have challenges like that. But boy, if you start seeing white people leaving communities, we've seen that in the civil rights movement. If you go back to the desegregation of schools with Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, when they sent 9 students in to desegregate that school, the community's response to that was they bucked desegregation so bad that they shut the school system down next year just to prevent any more students from coming. And then whites left the community. They were able to afford private schools to continue educating their kids, while people of color were left with a closed school system and missed a whole year of school. And then whites started leaving the community. If you go to Little Rock, Arkansas now, near Central High School, it's an all predominantly Black community that's in poverty and despair now. So stop running at the sight of challenges from our communities and dig in and stay invested. Actually move back to Youngstown if you're in the suburbs. Quite honestly, I'm speaking to myself too. You know what I mean? Like, I had to begin again with who I was because I didn't have a great sense. 15 years ago, you wouldn't be having this conversation with me. You know what I mean? Like, I wasn't that guy who I am now. But like I said before, when you know more, you'll do more. When you know better, you'll do better. And so, I can't espouse to others to make a commitment to a city I'm not committed to. But I can't sit back and let people continue to tell their kids, don't come to Youngstown. Your child has the answer to one of our challenges. They're going to create the next app that helps, resolve some conflict in our community. They're going to create the next small business that helps employ, 15, 20, 30, I don't know, but to tell them to take their talents elsewhere, it's just not going to help us with the way forward. And so get to know the real Youngstown, not the one that we read about from all of the national narratives that tries to use us as a backdrop for hopelessness and despair and crime and corruption all the time.
Well, and I think it's like in Youngstown, you got the Youngstown Business Incubator, you got American Makes, you got Youngstown State, the city. I live in the city, and I've lived in the city for, well, 10 years and then another 5 in college. So I've been around, and I love Youngstown, and
Yeah.
and I'm doing what you're doing, really investing and really making a difference, and moving forward. You never know where God will intend you to be.
Yeah. And so sometimes people ask me, hey, Derrick, what's next? I'm the same way as you just stated. I don't know what God has next, man. I just know that when my heart moves, I move, and so I believe that, God is the one who deposited this heart in me for this city and this community. And so when things strike me, I can't do it all. And so I don't try to do it all. It may appear on the surface that I am, but I have a very specific skill set and talent that I try and use for this community. And I like to do what most people say is stay in your own lane.
Yeah.
Now that's difficult. As I told you earlier, when I'm at a basketball game, I sound like a coach one minute, I sound like a ref the next minute. So I do cross over some lanes.
The only thing you need is a striped shirt.
Yeah, that's all I need. My wife's like, honey, like let the coach coach, But the other thing I'll tell people is you don't need to wait around on permission. See, that's why we call it the city of you, because it's made up of you and me and people who can take ownership of moments and say, you know what? I've been God-given this talent and this skill and this treasure, and I'm going to go give it away to this community. So if you're a photographer, do like they do in New York, where they have that Humans in New York. Go down and take pictures of the people you see walking around Youngstown and write their story. If you're a referee, try and engage beyond just the game and get to know some of these people, so the coaches of the schools. And so building relationships are important, because one day you might become Anthony Spano, who has his own Hope Classic, and you're going to need those relationships.
I think I've done that and gotten a little too old for refereeing anymore.
But yeah, I mean, it's a moment of great accountability and responsibility, and we've got to steward it well with what we've been given. To whom much is given, much is required. And so if you live in a safe neighborhood, wonderful. What about the people who don't? And what are you doing? If you can agree that not all cops are bad, wonderful. But there are some that need to be addressed. And what are you doing about that? If you can say that, your community has wonderful resources, what about the communities who don't? And so that's all this moment is about, is really coming out of ourselves and getting beyond who we are and getting into the work that so many others need us to engage in.
And I think that sums it up pretty good. And so you pretty much answered the last probably 5 or 7 minutes. You've answered a good portion of the questions that people either have submitted or written down on the comment section. I think the only question that didn't get answered that I'll bring up, it's going to come up on your screen. It's from Sean Allen. He says, these protests are 99% nonviolent, and these protests are definitely getting the right attention. Enough is enough. If change isn't coming now, then when?
I appreciate, Sean's question. I think it ends with a statement, or I guess a question that, I simply don't subscribe to. And I don't mean to sound disparaging when I say that, but I'll go back to John Lewis's quote. We have come a long way, and we're not turning back. And so change is coming because we commit to being those change agents. So don't sit back and wonder when change is becoming, become the change. And that's no matter what degree or what size or what contribution you're making, change is change. If you change, that's change. If I change, if I commit to looking within myself and changing, then that's change. And if we collectively all did that, oh, what change we could make if we all looked inside, and said, I've got some things that I need to change. That could be, mentality shift on some of the things you once believed. I had a friend who told me that her parents literally looked at her and said, when are you going to remember you're white? Because she advocated in ways that they didn't agree with. And so they must have believed that she was no longer a member of the white race simply because she got involved with causes that they believed weren't hers. So maybe it's your family members or friends need to change, and you can be that change agent starting right at home. But so for me, it's not a matter of if change is coming, no different than I said earlier, if you need help. There's not if anymore. We need help. And so when? The time is now. If not us, who? If not now, when? The answer is now. There is no more question to be had. We must take advantage of this environment. I spoke, briefly at our march, 2 Sundays ago, and I said, one of the things people espouse in this moment is climate change. We say that is the existential crisis affecting our generation and for generations to come. Well, I can tell you that's a true statement because the climate has changed. The climate of our community has changed. The climate of our city has changed. The climate of this country has changed, metaphorically and physically, and we need to take advantage of that change right now.
Well, that's all questions that were submitted because you answered a pretty good portion of them towards the last couple answers. So, Derrick, it was a pleasure to have you. I hope you enjoyed yourself. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Spanning the Need. Stay tuned as we'll be making other announcements on our guests in the future. Be safe and God bless. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony.